Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Sausys. The San Francisco Bay Area is one of the very fertile environments where yoga has evolved since coming to the West as per Krishnamacharya's request. He taught Indra Devi, Desikachar, Patabi Joyce, and Iyengar new adapted forms of the classical postures to continue making yoga available to all. While some teachers today focus on just the best-known aspects of asana or body postures, others bring the lesser-known components related to how yoga addresses the mind and the spirit to prepare individuals for spiritual realization. I have the pleasure of having here today Tony Briggs. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tony, a yoga practitioner for more than 35 years, studied with BKS Iyengar, Judith Lasater, Manouso Manos, Ramanand Patel, and Zhander Remete, and has continued studying Taoist Chi Gong with Larry Johnson. He is invested in helping his students find both an abiding stillness and a spaciousness that will serve them in their daily life in a real way. He teaches in various locations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Tony, our first question is, what was your first experience with yoga?
I was 33 years old, doing construction work, as a carpenter. And the fellow I worked with started dating a yoga teacher. Now this is back in the day when there was maybe 3 yoga teachers in San Francisco, right? He was dating one of them. So of course he dragged me to the class, which I really didn't like. It was all right. The teacher was fine. It just didn't grab me. So it took me a while. Since I've persisted all this 35 years, some people think, well, you must have loved it the first time, but actually I did not. It was, it was okay, but it was a bit of a chore for me and so forth. It took me quite some time to actually want to go to class on a regular basis. So my friend dragged me for some time, and then, of course, naturally, then my girlfriend started to drag me, and that was the beginning of the end right there. So that was my first experience.
Now, when did it actually happen for you that you tapped into yoga, that you had your first, let's say, true yogic experience?
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. I went along, like I described, somewhat reluctantly for almost 3 years. I mean, I was regular, going to my classes, but it didn't really take hold. And so at a certain point, I said, this is not for me, and I stopped. I gave myself permission to stop the practice. So I didn't practice at all for about 6 months. But then something inside of me said, you need to do that. One more shot, you should give it one more chance. So I did. I went back to class, and then it was completely different the second time. I loved to go there. I couldn't get enough of it. I was very hungry for it. But I had to somehow, for me, I had to give myself permission to not do it. So it wasn't obligatory anymore, but something about the process itself kind of reached out, and there was something in me that met that. But first I had to be okay with not doing it. Then I was able to really engage.
And was it asana, was it pranayama, was it meditation, or was it the whole thing that
all my initial training was all in Iyengar method, right, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So of course with that system, the focus is on asana and pranayama. And my teachers, I was lucky, the teachers that I was working with in the early days there did include pranayama as a regular part of the class, not every week, but very regularly. So that was always there. So those are the two practices, were the asana work and the pranayama work.
I see.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Iyengar. Was he your master or your guru, or what was your relationship to him?
Right. Well, I was lucky enough to be able to go to India to study with him at his institute there. And then I studied with him on several occasions also here in the United States when he would come, on teaching visits. But all of that time taken together was actually somewhat brief, really. And my main training came through his senior North American teachers. Those were my real, in the flesh, day in, day out teachers, right? And the time I spent with him was exceptional, actually, in both senses. You know, it was exceptional in the sense that I didn't have much of it, but also was exceptional in the sense that, you know, when you're around somebody like that, you just have to be in the room with them. It almost doesn't matter what they do or what they say.
Yeah.
It changes things for you, you know. So that impact was very strong, even though the total amount of time was not much. So as he's what I call my root teacher, right? He trained my teachers. I was lucky to study with him a little bit. But I'm in that lineage, but I can't claim to have a deep personal relationship with him like, say, some of my teachers do. So.
Tony, what is the most, or one of perhaps the most important teachings you got from Iyengar, you received from him as a root teacher?
I would have to say it's nothing about technique, really. It has much more to do with his commitment to the practice and to sharing the practice with other people. And this was something that he just transmitted just by his presence, you know. And I found it in my teachers that I mentioned earlier, that I studied with here in the Bay Area, right? I always felt when I was around him, or around them also, that there was something about this practice which was, I couldn't describe, but I felt if I could just get it, something in my life that actually mattered would change and get better. So it was somehow that was transmitted, you know. It didn't have nothing to do with the technique, the asana, the pranayama. That was different. There was a fascination about that, but this other thing was much more important. So.
Now, you mentioned that for the teachers you studied with, Iyengar was their master or their guru.
Yes, yes.
Now, in a society where today we overvalue independence and that no one tells us what to do, this very ancient tradition in yoga of the guru-disciple relationship maybe has a hard penetration, has a hard time getting. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. This is to overstate the case. On the one hand, you've got this guru-disciple relationship. And on the other hand, here in America, a consumer society, individualists, you have the customer is always right. And again, to overstate the case, you could almost say, once upon a time, the guru was always right. Now, the customer, the student, is always right. So these two are in direct conflict. And how we in America are going to navigate that is still developing, I think. It's still unknown at this point where that's going to end up. But I see it, again, I'm slightly overstating, oversimplifying, but I see that as a big obstacle, you know. I mean, once upon a time, if you, say you lived in some village someplace, you know, in India, let's say, or anywhere really, if you were interested in any kind of a spiritual practice, you probably had a choice of one teacher, the person that happened to be teaching in that village.
Yeah, that's it.
Whereas now, the whole world is your marketplace. And so people tend to, especially in our culture, they tend to pick and choose and pick and choose. And they talk about, you know, their individual choice and the value of that, which is valuable, but, you know, it doesn't mesh well. You know, I mean, nobody would say you should only have one choice of teacher, take it or leave it. I'm not saying that, you know. But I think too many choices does not actually lead to freedom, actually.
Yeah. Well, but also because in ancient times you were supposed to study a spiritual practice and just stick to it.
Right.
You were not supposed to change schools or change masters or no. And but even now, even in serious schools of study, this is more common that people. Yeah.
It is much more common. It obviously depends on the student, but I also think it depends partly on the teacher. For example, I was teaching a class a few weeks ago, you know, and I happened to be looking around, and I started to notice how many of the people in that room, it was very mixed, right? There was some beginner people, but I noticed how many of the people in that room had been studying with me for a long time. So just for fun, you know, I went around and I said, Barbara, how long have you been studying with me? 25 years. How long you been studying with me? Tracy, 22 years. And yet, 17 years. I have a lot of students who maybe kind of don't fit the picture, this stereotypical picture of the mobile student that's, always changing. I mean, of course I have those too.
Yeah.
But I've got a core of students who've been with me, 15, 18, 20 years. I mean, I'm very blessed that way.
Mm-hmm.
So even here, in this culture where there's infinite number of choices, some people still choose to stick with one or two people.
Yeah.
So
even with regular teachers, not just with masters or with gurus, people do that. They become more. Yeah. Now, Tony, we're talking about a certain preference or dependency to finding the answers outside, in media, in people, in tendencies, in what others do. Now, on the other hand, yoga says the answers are in the student.
Mm-hmm.
How do you integrate these two in your particular teachings?
Here again, I think this is a very interesting arena, very interesting. I mean, of course, it's part of the guru question.
Mm-hmm.
So, here's just a Thomas Merton story, right? Probably a lot of people know this story. It's from his autobiography. As he's a young man, he decides he's going to go to the monastery, right? So he tells this story. He's got his suitcase, and I think he took the bus or something to get there. Anyway, he walks up, and it's a gated community, He walks up, he knocks on the door, and he just stands there with his suitcase, all right? And then there's a fellow whose function is to open that door and let folks in. So he goes inside, Thomas Merton, he goes inside, he's standing in this big courtyard, And then behind him, the gate slams, boom. And he says, I never felt so free.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a pretty good story, So I guess I'm a believer in having practices, having disciplines. And part of what I think is helpful in that regard is having a teacher, So it's true we want to find something inside ourselves, in the long run, but most of us need help. We need help to do that. Most of us really can't do that on our own. It's so easy to get caught in our own delusion, self-delusion, Yeah. You can persist in that for your whole life, really. I mean, just look at my own life, I know this is an experiential fact. So what I often say in class, I say the human capacity for self-delusion is vast.
It's very vast.
It's very vast,
As vast as the mind.
As vast as the mind. Mm-hmm. And so most of us, we need some help. So I think there's the two kinds of help that are, I think, relevant here is having a practice, right? And also having a teacher. And in a sense, both of those things kind of limit your choices, like we were talking about earlier on. They limit your choices. But if it's an authentic practice, they're gonna limit your choices in a way which steers you away from that self-delusion and more toward like a real knowing of yourself and a real knowing of reality. If it's a mature system and it's a real teacher and so forth, I think it works that way. Now that's a tough sell, in our culture. That's a tough sell.
But for those who are willing to take it, because then once you devote yourself to the teachings of a guru, then the guru is telling you, you already know it, just go within and you'll find it. So it is empowering, it is independent, but it has that first step where one has to relinquish that fierce intention of independence.
Right, well it's like Thomas Merton, he goes to the monastery. Well now in the monastery, they tell him everything. This is when you get up, this is what you wear, this is what you eat. Basically he has no choices.
Yeah.
But even he was a young man at the time, but he had somehow had enough wisdom even as a young man to at least be willing to try this out as an experiment to see if this would make sense for him,
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something we can all kind of learn from that. So for myself, I'm the kind of person that, I stick with things. I stick with things, and it wasn't hard for me once I, as I described, once I kind of got into the river a little bit. It was not hard to stay there at all.
Yeah.
Here I still am.
And for yoga, yoga-based spiritual success in two core principles, which are practice and unattachment. So this is one of the ones you're bringing up, the importance of practice.
Yeah.
And do you find that this is something easy for Americans to take in, the fact of having a practice, having a discipline, or not?
I think it's rather difficult for them. I think it's quite difficult. I mean, if you think about it, almost because of the media, and also the schooling system, I mean, it's pervasive, you know. Basically, people are trained that whatever their like impulse is some sound basis for creating a life. You know, it's like, you know, what feels right for you, you should always follow that. That should be your guiding principle. You know, and I think that leads very quickly into that self-delusion we were talking about. You know, so I think the practice just keeps us safe. You know, keeps us safe from that. Well, you know, of course, in India, a lot of casually speaking, affectionately speaking, a holy man, they'll call him Baba, right? So one of my favorite Babas is Baba Dylan. In one of Bob Dylan's songs, he says, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." And I think what he's saying is, if you don't have a law, you know, a practice or a discipline to guide you, it takes an exceptional amount of honesty, you know, psychological honesty, emotional honesty, spiritual honesty. And I don't think most of us are that mature, you know, without some training and some help.
Yeah. So again, that's the help, the provided practice.
Yeah.
What you're naming that one of the most important values of practice then is to keep you safe from self-delusion.
Yeah.
What do you think are other values of practice?
Well, I think you mentioned the word non-attachment or detachment.
Unattachment.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, my main practices, of course, as I mentioned, have been asana and pranayama. And the meditation that I do, really, I see as an outgrowth of those practices, you know, which would be what Patanjali says. That's the order of things. And
going from the grosser to the more subtle.
Right.
So addressing first the body through asana, then breath work, and then meditation.
Right. So what I find in those practices, if you're patient with yourself and if you're observant, it sort of almost automatically, you know, leads you toward a sense of detachment, because you're developing what some people call, you're developing the witness, you know, the internal witness. You're watching yourself in the midst of the practice. I mean, to take it down to a very mundane kind of coarse level, let's say you're doing a pose, a yoga pose, and you're holding it for a while, and it's a strong stretch for you, so there's some discomfort, and to name it by its real name, there's some pain. Well, you can have different attitudes toward that, you know. But what yoga gives you an opportunity to sort of to detach from it, to depersonalize it, and say, well, there's the pain, and now there's my witnessing mind, and between us there's a space. So it's a very pragmatic way to cultivate this witness. Especially, I think this works much better if the practice is a slower moving practice. I think if you're moving very quickly, I think that's probably a lot harder to get to. But if you, in the system I was trained in, most people stereotypically would say, well, you know, you hold the pose a long time, and which is correct, you know. And I think there's a great value to that. It lets you have time to cultivate this witness mind, which is slightly detached from the somatic bodily experience. So then you can, at least there's a chance, an opportunity, you could have a more dispassionate relationship to whatever your physical experience happens to be at that moment.
Yeah.
And then of course it gives you time to notice how things change without volition.
Yeah.
Right? Because the pain goes away is what happens if you stay in a pose and you simply stay there with this detached sort of observant mind. My experience, what often happens is it just changes by itself, spontaneously.
Yeah. And if you're still, then you can witness the change more easily.
Right, right.
Well, also, I would imagine you agree that in order for yoga to be effective as it is in relationship to the autonomic nervous system or to processes such as the digestion or regulation of blood pressure. These are things that need time.
They need time.
They need time for you to do. I mean, and I don't mean time of practice sustained throughout time. I just mean time of exposure to one pose.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
I think here's another thing where Americans, through no fault of their own really, have been not given much practice doing that, you know. And I think that's crucial. You know, I think I remember when I was, here, let me give you an example of my teaching. I remember after I'd been teaching for about 5 years, I thought I was a pretty good teacher, you know. And after 10 years, I looked back and I said, oh my God. You know, so it took me, you know, 10 years to even to realize what a long-term process it was. It took me 10 years even to, I mean, you can know these things intellectually. That's easy, okay.
Yeah.
But to know it experientially, it took me a long time to realize, oh, this is a lifelong process. You know, and of course the same thing is true with the practice itself, whether or not you're teaching. With the practice itself, and you realize, looking back, I mean, like for example, my practice right now is nothing like the practice I did, you know, in the beginning. But it shouldn't be. You know, I mean, I was a young man then.
Yeah.
You know, like right now, I'm 69 years old. If I'm still practicing at age 69, when I was practicing at 30, something's not right.
Yeah.
You know, so but I find all you have to do is just be persistent, and the practice will change itself. You almost don't have to decide. It doesn't need to be, you know, programmatic. You just have to sit in the practice long enough, and it will change.
And then have the experience. Yes.
Yeah.
Now we know that yoga mainly addresses the body, and we know that yoga's pursuit is spirituality, ultimately. So even when suggesting a pose or when offering a pose, the ultimate destination is the connection with spirit.
Yeah.
Now, we know that asana addresses the body mainly, and I understand that you like pranayama. That is something that you are familiar with. Now, what would you say is the main intention of pranayama or breath work? Because not everybody knows what pranayama is.
Right. Well, it depends on which book you want to read.
Very well, yes.
You know, I'm sure you know this scholar of religion, Eliade, you know his work?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, for some reason I found myself rereading his big book, Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom, last week. I don't know why. And in there he's talking about yoga wants to be, the practices of yoga, they're all kind of designed, he overstates the case, but he said they're designed kind of to make you sort of non-human or even almost anti-human, by which he means to escape from the sort of the unconscious, mundane, you know, habitual way we go about things. Okay, he's talking about that. So, for example, if you take an asana, think of all the different ways a person could move. Well, you restrict yourself to only a few, right? So of all the possible ways postures that a human body could take for, let's say, 30 seconds or whatever, you say, I'm only going to do triangle pose, Trikonasana, that's all. So there's a voluntary, you know, giving away of options. Now, when he gets to pranayama, he's the same thing, right? You take sort of unconscious, chaotic breath, which is random breaths, what most of us have, and you try and make it conscious and you regulate it. And then he goes further. He says, and the yogi's dream is to stop breathing altogether. He talks that way. He's a fun guy, actually, right? So what is the purpose? I mean, well, he would say it has the same purpose as, say, an asana practice, right? Or then when you get to the meditation, it's the same thing. You've got this scattered mind. And the first stage of meditation is you try to get one pointedness, this ekagrata focus, right? And the breath is doing the same thing. There's a scattered, chaotic breath. You try and bring it to a focus. And the body, same thing. Instead of random, chaotic movement, you try and harmonize. So at different levels, each of these practices is pointing you in the same direction, leading you down that singular path, right? So the breath is, traditionally, right, that's considered the gateway pranayama to the more inner practice, traditionally, right?
Yes,
it's the gateway
the
drug,
deeper practice,
right?
yes.
Yeah. And it seems so, that's my experience.
Mm-hmm. Now also, because of the fact that every time our minds change in nature or in quality, our breath changes.
Absolutely.
Correspondingly.
Absolutely.
Would you also agree that breathwork pranayama is one of the best ways of addressing the mind?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, I think it has the most direct impact on your nervous system. I mean, to put it in kind of in Western allopathic medical kind of terms, I think it has the most direct impact, And the asana, it works indirectly, right? Because the asana will change the breath, of course. Right?
As well, yes.
Yeah. But if you're doing the breath work itself, it's very. Look, in the olden books, they would say, you have to be careful with the breath work. I think they say something. It's like you're trying to tame, tigers and elephants.
Yeah, it's very serious work.
It's a serious business and dangerous. They were very cautious. The old timers, very cautious with this breath work. And that's because it's because it is so potent.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, it's dangerous because it has a potency which could also lead you in a good direction, lead toward a transformation that you're really seeking. Okay,
yeah.
It has that power, so that's why it's dangerous. And it has that power, I think, because it's a direct connection, right into the mind, the nervous system, the mind. It goes right there, and like I said, the asana work, same but indirectly.
Yeah. Well, and also because it's a straight connection with breath and therefore with life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you read, for example, Hatha Yoga, the medieval actual Hatha Yoga books. So, say you go back. I don't remember the exact dates of Bhagavad Gita. You probably know, Antonio. Is it?
Not the exact dates.
Yeah, it's something like 300-400 BC,
Yeah.
something like that, right? And then Patanjali is usually considered around the time of Christ, but then you move on from there up into, say, 14th, 15th, 16th century texts. These are the texts that would be considered actual Hatha Yoga texts. So these are like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Shiva Samhita, Garanda Samhita, these things, right? Okay, well, if you read those books, which they're the books that have the most, for us, the most recognizable discussion, of technique.
Yeah.
Their primary concern in those books is almost always pranayama. I mean, they'll have an asana section, it's maybe four pages long.
Yes.
And then they finish with that.
Like a break.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Let's have a break. Let's
have a break.
practice asana.
Right. Let's get up and move a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
But so have maybe 3-4 pages, just a few verses on the asana work, right? And then they'll have 30-40 pages on the pranayama. And of course these books quote each other a lot, right? But one of the things that they say all along is, the life and the breath, and this is obvious at a banal level, the life and the breath go together. When the breath stops, the mind stops, the life stops. So this is the key, what can we say, element or action. It's not moving the bodies.
This concludes the first part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing Tony Briggs. He's a yoga practitioner who's been practicing for over 35 years. He studied with BKS Iyengar, Judith Lasater, Manouso Manos, Ramanand Patel, and Zhander Remete, and has continued studying Taoist Chi Gong with Larry Johnson. He is invested in helping his students find both an abiding stillness and a spaciousness that will serve them in their daily life in a real way. He teaches in various locations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. I hope you like our show today. And if you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com. I look forward to seeing you the next time